Welcome, everybody. As I introduced myself earlier, my name is Jaya, and I know most of you, but perhaps not all. And for those of you who I haven't had the good fortune yet to meet, I'd like to mention that my wife and I, Sadhana Devi, sitting over here, we serve in India at the ashram there in Gurgaon. So, on behalf of all of the fellow Sangha devotees from India, I'd like to wish you all Master's blessings as well. And some of you may or may not know that yesterday was Independence Day in India. And so I'd like to say hello to because I understand that this is being broadcast elsewhere, perhaps even our members in India are saying, I'd like to wish them all a happy Independence Day, a day belatedly, but Bharata Mata Ki Jai. So. I came to our topic today, as you remember, is science and meditation. And I came to these teachings many years ago by first reading, perhaps like you, the autobiography of a yogi. And perhaps like you, or perhaps maybe not, but when I first read that book, it was a bit difficult for me. I was tremendously inspired, but I had a hard time believing all of the statements in there. They were way beyond my comprehension. People materializing in wheat fields and other fellows with two bodies and so on. I had a difficult time believing that. I was a rational young man, perhaps a little bit too rational, perhaps. And I tended to be, I think, like many Americans and perhaps young Americans. Not only was I rational, but I tended to be, and perhaps still have this a little bit of a trait, I tend to be very skeptical. Particularly skeptical of unusual statements. And so I found myself in a difficult quandary because within that book, I felt a great sincerity from the author of that book. And so although I was skeptical and I didn't believe, I made what I think was a fateful decision. I chose not to disbelieve. I didn't believe, but I chose not to disbelieve at the same time. In other words, I left the question in balance because I was wise enough, even at that young age, to realize that I did not yet have all the answers. Many perhaps, but not all. I didn't yet have all the answers. And so I left it in abeyance. And I adopted what I think is something of a scientific approach. I said, I am going to test. I'm going to try. I'm going to see if this is true. And what is the basis when we speak about science? What are some of the basic attributes of science? Observation, experimentation. And so I approached this in a very scientific way. I said, I am going to see. And so my quest took me to meeting Swami Kriyananda and ultimately learning Kriya Yoga. And I began to test. And little by little, these things that seemed so very outrageous and unlikely, one by one, they began to prove themselves through my own experimentation and my own experience. I cannot say that I have worked my way fully through that list of that book because, as you know, there's some very, very deep teachings there. But this is the essence when we speak about science. And we want to speak a little bit about science today. And Dr. Peter, as you know, as a medical doctor, is going to be sharing some from the very technical, little bit more technical side. I'm going to share a little bit from, you might say, a very different side. But yet coming back to this issue of testing and experimentation. Now, as I mentioned, as a young American man, and now is a little bit older, living in India, I often have asked the question of, what have you noticed the difference between East and West? Do you see any differences? Well, obviously, yes, I do. I see differences, and I don't have much time today to speak about all those observations. Sadhana Devi and myself will be giving a satsang on Thursday afternoon. So if you'd like to pursue this further, please come to the satsang. But I have noticed there are some differences. And one of the things that I've noticed that Americans Perhaps Europeans too, but I'm not quite so familiar with Europe. But particularly Americans tend to be a very rational temperament. They're like I said I myself was. I was at a younger age, very rational. And also, as I said, they tend to be skeptical. But I think sometimes overly so, overly skeptical, because oftentimes that over skepticism tends to block the ability to perceive something deeper when it gets to be, you might say, something of a skeptical disease. Swamiji used to give this illustration, speaking about two fellows riding on the train. And they were looking out the window of the train, and there on the hillside, nice hillside outside the train, there were sheep. And the sheep had just recently been shorn of their wool. And the one fellow said to the other, "Oh, look at those sheep. They've just recently been sheared." And the other fellow said, "Well, on this side at least." And I have to admit, I could see a little bit of myself in that. Wasn't going to assume anything. Whereas I found that, if you have that tendency, and which is actually there's some positive aspects of that, because you're not going to accept something without proof. And that's good. But taken to extreme, a certain blockage begins to come in. And I think what it does is, if it's taken to extreme, we begin to block the possibility of being open to other possibilities. And I think as I've grown up, I hope a little bit I've been able to set some of those attitudes aside. But I know going to India, it's helped me in that way. Because in one way, it's opened me up a little bit to other possibilities as well. And then this is not to say that the Indians are not rational or they're irrational. I don't mean that at all. But yet, there seems to be in the Indian temperament an openness to other possibilities as well. And you might say, in that openness, you open yourself to intuitive experience a little bit more. And so you find in India, actually, the Indian people, the temperament is very philosophical. The Indians are a philosophical people, but it's balanced by a very deep devotion. The Indians are extremely devotional, but yet they're philosophical at the same time. And there's also an openness. And so that intuitive flow often in India begins to flow more readily, and you find that there's less blockage. And so in India, you find people have amazingly common, often, I find it not so uncommon, experiences. Spiritual experiences come to people because they haven't put up these barriers of heavy Western skepticism, sarcasm, over-rationality. Now, I'd like to tell you a story. Since I am from India for the last 5-6 years, I thought I'd give this a little bit of an Indian flavor. And so I'd like to tell you a story from India. Now, some people say that this is a myth. I'll let you judge. Long ago, Indra, king of the worldly gods, was riding on his elephant. And he was riding through the jungle or the forest, and he came upon a rishi. And this rishi's name was Durvasa. And he came upon Durvasa, and Durvasa had finished his morning prayers, his morning puja. And Durvasa, in welcoming of Indra, riding on his elephant, king of the gods, presented from his morning worship a garland that had been blessed. And he presented it to Indra to take. Well, Indra, king of the gods, had developed a little bit of arrogance. He'd been a little bit prideful. So he received the garland, but instead of putting that garland around himself, what he did is he put it on the elephant instead. Some say he put it on the tusk of the elephant. I don't know which account is true. But he put it on the head of the elephant, let's say. He put it on the head of the elephant, and what did the elephant do? But it shook the garland off onto the ground, and he stamped on it. Well, this was very, very disrespectful. And Durvasa, seeing this, was angered. Now, there's one thing you do not want to do in India, is anger a rishi. Because what inevitably happens when a rishi is angered, he curses you. And so, true to form, Durvasa curses Indra for his impotence, for his lack of reverence, for his arrogance. And so Indra becomes cursed. Well, Indra tries to apologize because he's now found himself in a difficult situation. But as much as he apologizes, Durvasa refuses to relent. And he curses him that he will begin to lose his power. And by extension, all the other gods in this realm will begin to lose their power. And so Indra, sure enough, as time goes by, he begins to lose his power. The other gods begin to lose their power. And as they lose their power, the Asuras, the devils, you might say, of this world, of this realm, begin to take over. They begin to take over the kingdom. The gods begin to recede from the kingdom. Now, you must understand, in this kingdom, the Devas and the Asuras are always at war with one another, seeking to control the kingdom. Well, the Devas begin to decline. Seeing this happen, Indra is quite disturbed. And he goes to Lord Vishnu, Lord of the eternal realms, all realms. And he goes to Lord Vishnu and he explains his plight. And Lord Vishnu gives him a suggestion, feeling sympathy for him. He gives him a suggestion and a remedy. He says, Indra, what you must do is you must go to the ocean and you must churn the entire ocean. And in this churning, you must churn and you must churn until you bring up from the ocean the nectar Amrita, this nectar of immortality must be churned from that ocean. And then, drinking of that, you'll regain your kingdom. Now, to churn the ocean is no small feat. And he did not have enough in terms of the gods themselves, couldn't do this by themselves. So they made peace with the Asuras, because the Asuras too wanted to become immortal. They too wanted to drink of this nectar. And so together the gods and the Asuras joined forces and they decided to churn the ocean. But how do you do that? So they went to the ocean, and the first thing they did is they solicited Mount Mandara, large mountain, to be the pole and to be the churning instrument. They would churn Mount Mandara. But how are you going to churn and turn Mount Mandara? Well, they went to Vasuki, the king of the serpents. And Vasuki wound himself around Mount Mandara. And with the Asuras on one side of Vasuki and the Devas on the other side, they began to pull and churn and spin that mountain in the ocean. And what began to happen? The ocean began to be churned. And as it was churned, various things began to come out of the ocean, began to materialize out of that churning ocean. But the first thing that began to come out was poison. All poisonous things began to form and coalesce and come to the surface of that ocean to such an extent that it threatened to destroy everything living in the world. The poison was everywhere coming. And then so the Devas and probably the Asuras too, they went and they prayed to God. And Shiva, Lord Shiva comes and volunteered to drink or to take that poison into his mouth and hold it in his throat. And so even today, even to this day, if you see the pictures of Lord Shiva, you will see that he has a blue throat. And this is why he's called Nilkant, which means blue throat. And as evidence of this happening many years ago, he still has that blue throat. Well, the poison was gone and they continued to churn, but this was heavy, heavy, hard work. And many of the times they wanted to give up. But when they gave up, Vishnu would shower them with cooling rains, encouraging them, continue your work, you're doing fine. And they continued very, very diligently until finally other things began to come out of that ocean. Wonderful boons came out of that ocean. There was a cow, gift-giving cow came out of the ocean. Lakshmi, goddess of wealth, prosperity, came out of that ocean. And one of the things that perhaps we're familiar with, because we sing about it from time to time, the wishing tree came out of that ocean. Now I'm going to pause a moment in the story. The wishing tree, the wishing tree, give me pranayam, give me salvation. Pranayam is salvation. Pranayam is the wishing tree. And this wishing tree, now some people say it doesn't exist. It's just a story. But I don't think they know. This wishing tree really does exist. And this is what every one of us, devotees, Kriya Yogis, people on the spiritual path, maybe even of those that don't know it, this is what all of us are trying to find. And it can be found if we learn to churn the ocean, you see. This wishing tree, if you sit under this wishing tree, what happens is all of your wishes come true for anybody who sits under that wishing tree. Now this story up to this point, it sounds, many people, as I said, think this is a myth. But I think those of you who are Kriya Bandhs, do you see? I think the way to find out if this is a myth is we should apply science to this. We should test it. Test it and experiment and see for ourselves. And this is what all of us are doing who practice Kriya Yoga. We're doing exactly this. We're churning the ocean of our mind. We're churning the ocean of our inner consciousness. Every day when we practice our Kriya Yoga, we rotate that churn. We rotate that energy around. We rotate around that central pole of the spine, that Mount Mandara. We rotate the currents as symbolized by the Serpent King. We rotate those around that mountain within ourselves. And of course, I skipped one little part of that story. When they first started to churn that mountain, they found that pole kept sinking into the mud down below. Until finally Vishnu himself came and he incarnated as a tortoise, they say now, a turtle maybe. And they placed the pole upon him. That churning needs to be established on a firm base. A firm base in our faith in God. We churn that until finally in that churning begins to come and precipitate out of that ocean. Various things begin to come. And first comes poison. You could say all of that karma from the past, all of those obstacles, all of those difficulties, and we want to give up. But God encourages us, and He rains down blessings upon us and encourages us to keep going, keep going. But finally so much it seems to come out that it's going to overtake us, all the obstacles that we find pitted against ourselves, and we call on God, and God comes and swallows that poison. If we offer it up to Him, He swallows that poison. And once that poison, that karma is gone, wonderful gifts begin to come. It says in the Bible, "Seek ye first the kingdom of God, and all these things will be added unto you." And this is what we're talking about here. Everything that your heart desires ultimately will be yours. But first we must work for it. We must do our sadhana. We must do all of the hard work, even in the face of all those obstacles. Now, the story continues on, of course, that once all these beautiful objects came out, they put them aside and they continued churning. And you see, this too is an important lesson for us. Many people would stop the churning right then. You see, all these beautiful obstacles come because your heart's desires will be fulfilled. But that's not the purpose of why we're doing this churning. That's not the purpose why we're practicing. We must practice until we extract, you could say, that Amrit that is in the ocean. Until then, we have achieved our goal. And so the Devas and the Asuras continue to churn until finally, yes, the Amrit precipitates out. But in the midst of that, the Asuras steal it. They take it for themselves. They take it, and they want to become immortal. I think probably the Devas had their eyes elsewhere, but they take it. But again, Vishnu comes to the aid. He comes to the aid and he incarnates. He appears in form as the goddess Mohini. And she comes and she's beautiful. She's the enchantress. She's so beautiful that the Asuras take their eye a little bit off of their goal and eventually talks them into giving her the Amrit, which she then gives back to the Devas. And ultimately the Devas do achieve their immortality. Now, this is just a story, right? But it's not. It's not a story. It is a story. It's typically in India. Truths are clothed, very important truths, are clothed in symbolism, images, in stories such as this. But there are deep truths there, and this tale is told in all the epics and the ancient literature in many different forms. What I've told you, one form of it, but there are others as well, and because it encapsulates a basic truth. Now, the important thing to remember here for us is that each of us were seeking that divine, but we have to be willing to experiment and test for ourselves. We have to be willing to approach it in this scientific way of not taking it upon belief, but practicing this very truth that is expressed in this teaching. Science has that as its basis. And I think this is why science, you might say, it's the modern religion, because science will give thee salvation. Technology is the wishing tree. All of this is in the modern Dwapara Yuga. This seems to be the modern way. But nevertheless, we do not want to overlook the ancient way as well. These truths are encapsulated throughout the ages, throughout the millennia. They're presented in many different ways, but the same principle holds in the ancient days as well as in the modern days. Yoga is based on this science of religion, or the science of religion, to test, to see for ourselves. Now, the Western mind, I think this is particularly important for us here in the West, is because I've been practicing these techniques now for many years, decades myself. And I've noticed, one of the things that's often asked, what do you find differences? I began speaking about East and West. And Swami Kriyananda has often mentioned this, and I found this to be true. He said when teaching in India, one of the advantages of teaching there is you don't need to convince the audience that what you're presenting is worthwhile. And so I notice in America, this is much more necessary. You have to, as Swamiji said, sometimes it seems you spend the first half convincing the audience that you're not a fool and that you are a charlatan and that you have something to present. Well, maybe it's not quite that bad, but nevertheless, I've noticed in India, I don't need to speak about why a person should meditate, why this is a good thing. I touch on it a little bit, but it's accepted already that, yeah, this is a good thing. This is something that we should do. And so this does make it easier. But of something that I've learned over all of these years of meditating, teaching, is, and I think it's appropriate here in the West in the study of yoga, yoga will give us everything we want. It is the wishing tree. All of these things come to us. Often people approach the spiritual path and they'll say, I want to be happy, I want to be healthy, I want to have good relationships, I want to get a better job. I want to live a harmonious life. I want this, I want that. Now, what's the common theme in all those statements? I want. I want. Something I've learned over all these years. I, in that sense, will never be happy. I will never be happy. And when you approach it in that way, you finally, when you churn this ocean enough, you finally come to the realization that that I, that too, must be a gift. You have to give that away. You have to give that sense of I-ness away. And so often the emphasis, particularly in the West, is doing these things, approaching yoga because how much it's going to give you. Now, I don't think that's necessarily bad because it gets you started. And it gets all of us started. We have to have, you could say, we need an ego. We need this ego, the sense of I accomplishing something in order to get going. But there comes a point when that too has to be given away. Now, Divine Mother gives us many, many gifts in life. Yoga will give you many, many gifts in life. But remember, she's happy to give you gifts. She loves to give you gifts. She loves to give you everything. Because if she does and you're happy, she doesn't have to give herself. But this is what ultimately we really want. Divine Mother will give us everything, but will she give us her love? No. Not until she's convinced that we want her alone. We want her alone. And it's a very narrow path, yoga. Only is it God or I, you might say in that lower sense, walking on that path. It's a narrow path. And ultimately it's good. All of these things she's wanting to give us are good. But remember, she'll give them to us for what's in our highest benefit. But give them back. Share them. Expand your sense of who you are. But don't seek just for that. Remember, ultimately we practice yoga for God, in order to gain God and be able to give that sense that ourselves up to God. And this will come, but we have to do the work. We have to experiment. We have to churn that ocean. And this is what we're doing when we practice Kriya Yoga. Remember that. And I found that I can improve my, you could say, I think you're much like me, is that your meditation will improve, your practice will improve. When you meditate, don't meditate to become happy. Don't meditate to become healthy. Don't meditate to become, to solve your, whatever that problem is. Meditate for love. See your meditation, see your Kriya, practice your Kriya as an offering of that little self, which is symbolized, you might say, by your breath, that sense of I. That very breath, you're offering it up as something, as a sacrifice. And God, when he sees that purity of heart, ultimately will accept that offering. And then you'll find God comes and all those other things come too. Seek ye first the kingdom of God, and all this other things will be added unto you. Many blessings. Thank you for having this SRW here after so many years. It's wonderful, wonderful opportunity for all of us to share together.